Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Harry Lauseneziris, and this is my YouTube channel, grecochess. We're currently showing games suggested by my Facebook friends. And yesterday, in the previous video, we showed a game suggested by Kutsogyiannopούλου, who is both a Facebook friend of mine and also a subscriber of the channel. In the previous video, she caused an upset because she defeated Anna Maria Bozzari in spite of the fact that Anna Maria had a rating 400 points higher than Theodora. In this video, we're going to show another game that she selected. It was against Sebastian Mihajlov from Croatia. It took place in Palαιοχώρα, Crete. This is at the south end of Greece. The year was 2014. When the game took place, once again, Theodora was the underdog. Her rating was 1855 versus 2227 of Sebastian. Currently, 11 years later, Sebastian's rating has increased to 2361. Theodora's is almost the same, a little bit lower, 1840. And we're going to the screen of chess.com. And we're going to show to you what happened. We're going to present the game. You're going to see only a part of the screen, and I'm going to explain you why. The same reason like in the previous game. Both of the games are displayed in links of chess.com, and we are going through these links move by move. But if I show the entire screen, you would see the next moves and you would see how the game progressed. And in order to avoid spoiling the next of the game and keeping the suspense, we are going to display only the part of the screen that's relevant, the part of the screen that shows the situation on the board. As you see below, Sebastian had the white pieces and Theodora had the black pieces. And we are starting the game. Sebastian played a standard way. Pawn goes to d4, which together with pawn going to e4 are the most popular moves for white to begin. And Theodora replied with what's called the Indian opening. The knight went to f6. The notes say, the computer knows the Indian game is a collection of openings defined by this move. Why do they call it Indian? Because before chess had its current rules, in the old rules that were more famous in India, pieces moved differently, so starting the knight was the best way to do so, as far as I know. I might be wrong. Next move, and as I have mentioned in previous video, when you push the d pawn, the next pawn to move is the c pawn, goes to c4, and Theodora pushes the pawn to g6, from g7 to g6. Once again, preparing for the bishop to go to g7 and have the fianchetto. Next move, knight to c3, expected. Knight can go to c3 without blocking the c pawn. Bishop to g7, and the fianchetto for black, the dark colored bishop, controls the entire diagonal from, not exactly controls, but at least influences, puts pressure on the diagonal from a1 to h8. Next move for Sebastian, pawn to e4. So Sebastian has 3 pawns in the center, c4, d4, e4. It's wonderful to have them, but we're still following book theory. You see the little book here, and we'll go to follow it for quite some time. And Theodora is going to push the pawn to d6, and by doing so, she gives more power to her bishop on c8. It's not blocked any longer by the d7 pawn. Sebastian develops the knight to f3 and short side castling, king side castling for Theodora. We have completed 5 moves. All of them are book moves. Sebastian has a very small advantage of 0.6 just because he started first. Continue the game. And Sebastian doesn't want his knight on g4 to be pinned, and that's why he pushes a pawn from h2 to h3. Theodora will push the pawn to e5 to have influence over the center, and we pushed a little bit too far. And yes, Sebastian will push his pawn to d5. He has a pawn in black's half of the board. And Theodora will reply by expanding in queenside. Pawn goes to a5. Bishop to e3 for Sebastian. Develops the Dakala bishop. Knight to a6 for Theodora. You may have heard that you shouldn't put the knight on the edge. As I say, a knight on the rim is grim and ready for the trim, but in this case, it's only, I believe, a temporary allocation. From a6, the knight can go to c5 or to b4. Pawn to g4 for Sebastian. He wants to attack along the king side. If left on his own devices, soon the g and the h pawns will be very near the black king. Theodora is going to push her other knight to f7 and thus gives the queen a little bit more power. From d8, it's not blocked by the knight on f6 any longer. We completed 9 moves, and until now we followed theory that gives white a small advantage of 0.6. From move number 10, white will deviate from theory. Bishop goes to d3. Computer believes it's an inaccuracy. The comment is there were worse moves, but also something much better. That's what the computer, which by the way is Stockfish16, says about this move. What would the computer like? The rook to go to g1 and support the pawn on g4 and perhaps help it go to g5. Of course, this would mean that white cannot castle kingside, but with the pawn on g4 and h3, white should not castle kingside in any case. And Sebastian's advantage has fallen to 0.2. Theodora is going to push the knight on c5, from d7 by the way to c5. In fact, both knights could go to c5. Theodora will push her d7 to c5, and this gives also more space to her bishop on c8, not blocked by the d7 knight any longer. At this point, we completed the first 10 moves. Sebastian has an advantage of 0.2, a very small advantage. Let's see how the game will continue. Bishop goes to c2 because Sebastian did not want his bishop to exchange for the black knight. And let's continue. The bishop of c8 is developed to d7. Not the best move, but here's a check mark, a good move. Rook to g1 for white, for Sebastian. Computer says this is not the right idea. Before it liked it. Now it doesn't. What the computer would like is the pawn to go to a3 and block the black knight from coming to b4. And Theodora will push the pawn to c6. Applying pressure to white's pawn changes the computer, but it's only a good move, not the best. Queen to e2 for Sebastian. Computer says it is a mistake. Only one move worked there, and this wasn't it. Of course, they mean that the move that would work is if the pawn from d5 takes a pawn on c6, but of course it's not easy. It's easy for the computer to see them after the game. It's not easy during the game to give up on a pawn that you have well placed on your opponent's half of the board. As a result of this mistake, of this move of white, black Theodora for the first time ever is ahead by 0.3. Still, the margin is very small. Knight to b4 for Theodora. Computer thinks it's inaccuracy and allows the opponent to eventually win material, but once again, it's quite a temptation to have your knight on the opponent's part of the board. It's not exactly an outpost because it can be thrown back by moving the pawn to a3, but it's nice to have it. Move number 14. Sebastian, once again does not want to exchange his bishop, and it goes from c2 to b1. Computer thinks it's a miss. Why? Because if instead the pawn had gone to a3, the knight on b4 would have been driven away, but not necessarily. Could have exchanged itself with the bishop on c2. But the computer thinks that the bishop is more important than, excuse me, the knight on b4 is more important than the bishop on c2. And let's see how Theodora will continue. Pawn goes to a4, inaccuracy. I'd rather have the pawn go to b5 and attack the key chain, the pawn chain. We'll continue with, I hope I have his name correct this time. It is Sebastian. Sebastian is going to take the bishop on, excuse me, the bishop of Sebastian from e3 is going to take the knight on c5. And by doing so, of course, white doesn't have the two bishop advantage any longer, but black is forced to have double pawns along the c file. And we continued, and at this point we completed the first 15 moves. Black Theodora has a small advantage of 0.2, which of course is not crucial, cannot decide the game, but better have the advantage than your opponent having it. And we continue now. Sebastian will send his pawn to a3, and now computer thinks it's a great. So Sebastian earns his first exclamation point and kicks back the knight on b4. Now the knight cannot grab the bishop or anything else, must go back, and not too many squares to go back. I think a6 is the only safe square to go. And of course, that's what Theodora is going to do. Not too much choice. The best move when you have only one reasonable choice and very easy to see. And now with the knight going back, Sebastian can place his bishop on c2. Good moves is the computer. You see the check. Of course, the computer would rather have the bishop go to d3 and also give extra protection to the c4 pawn. And now, Theodora will grab the pawn on d5, but white, instead of pushing one of their pawns to d5, is going to place the knight on d5. The computer doesn't like it, thinks a mistake, would rather have the e4 pawn go to d5. Is a knight an outpost on d5 protected by two pawns? Yes, it is. There are no pawns on the c and the e files to throw it away because they have already advanced to c5 and e5, but the bishop on d7 can attack it. And of course, the knight on a6 can go to c7 and attack it. So yes, it cannot be attacked by pawns, but it can be attacked by black's pieces. How will Theodora continue? Pawn goes to b5. The computer would rather have the knight go to c7 and attack the knight on d5. b5 is a mistake. This will lose a pawn. Let's see how. If pawn on c4 takes b5, if bishop takes back from d7, then queen can take the bishop on b5 and white is a pawn ahead. But still, in spite of that, the computer thinks that Theodora is ahead by 0.2. Let's see how the game will continue. Pawn goes to b5. Yes, the best move. That was the free pawn, says the computer. And now black will not use the bishop to take the pawn, but will use the queen for check on a5. What black is hoping is that no matter how white responds, then the bishop can take on b5 and the queen cannot take on b5 because it's supported by the queen. But let's see if this is going to be really the case. And it's not going to be the case because the knight goes to c3 and protects the pawn on b5. And thus white can keep the extra pawn even though it's a double pawn. But the computer doesn't like it. It would rather have the king go to f1. The comment of the computer says the better move was to evade the check from the opposing queen, meaning put the king on f1. We're going to see white because really, if I was white, this is the move that would have come to my mind. Keep the extra pawn. Since you can keep it, why not? And now also black has to spend a move saving the a6 knight. Black needs to do something, and there are not too many somethings to do. Then I can either go to b7, to c7, or to b8. Clearly, the bishop cannot take from d7, cannot take the pawn on b5 because queen takes it, and then the white queen on a5. If they take the queen on b5, the knight will take back. Let's see what black is going to do. Basically, there are only two moves to choose from, and out of these two, obviously the c7 is better because the b8 will block the a8 bishop, and the a8 rook and the two rooks cannot communicate with each other. And you want, at least for until the middle game, for the rooks to be able to communicate with each other, have as much freedom as possible in the 8th rank for black or the 1st rank for white. And yes, that's what Theodora will do. Knight goes to c7. We completed the first 20 moves. And you see the situation. White has an extra pawn in material advantage here. But when it comes to the overall position, the computer gives a 0.7 for black. Not decisive yet. And usually, at least for beginners, not at the level of Sebastian Theodora, but for beginners, material advantage is very important because it's much easier to keep it, while positional advantages, lower rated players cannot easily notice them, and even if they notice them, not easy to keep them. I mean, many of them are temporary, meaning unless you play the best possible way, you can very easily lose them. Let's see how game continues. Sebastian gets another pawn at a4. Clearly, the black queen cannot take on a4 because there's a knight on c3, and of course, if the queen takes the bishop, then the knight is not pinned any longer, so it can grab the queen. And of course, Theodora is not going to do it. Rook from f8 goes to b8. What would the computer prefer? I say it's a mistake. Is for the knight from c7 to go to d5. You may, first of all, the knight on c3 cannot grab it because of the pin. The pawn can take it, but then the pawn from e5 can go to e4, and really the knight on c3 is in danger, meaning bishop can grab it. If pawn takes back, queen takes back, and then the rook on a1 is lost. Of course, there are ways for white to reply, but really black would be doing very well. That is why now let's see how the advantage is changing. Before, Theodora had an advantage of 0.7. Now Sebastian has an advantage of 0.8, 1.5 points of a swing. Sebastian continues with long side castling, and the computer thinks the best. And you see that the bishop on d7 is under attack and is undefended. Black needs to do something. And it's going to take the pawn on b5. Great moves as a computer. And let's see, the computer thinks that black will be able to regain one of the 2 points they're behind. And let's see why. The bishop is attacked by 3 pieces from white. Bishop a4, knight b5, queen e2. And this defended by 3 pieces. Knight c7, rook b8, and queen a5. So if we start all the, as they call it, take, the series of exchanges, in the end, black will have gained one of the 2 points they were behind. Will the game go like that? Knight goes to b5. Computer would rather have the bishop take it back. Knight takes to b5 for black. Bishop to b5, rook to b5. We did all the exchanges, and white's material advantage from 2 pawns has gone down to 1 pawn. Queen to c4 for white. Sebastian and computer thinks it's a great move. it is a little bit risky. You don't want to put your queen and your king at the same file, the C file. Of course, there's a pawn on C4, but otherwise there could be the danger of a rook going to C8, and if it was protected and the pawn was not on C4, then the queen on, excuse me, on C5, the queen on C4 would be pinned. These things don't happen yet, but you better keep them in your mind, especially make sure you don't start a combination that may end up in a position like that. What will Theodora do? Put her rook on A7. Perhaps hoping that the rook from E7 can go to C7 and put pressure on the queen on C4. But the computer thinks a mistake, says there was only one good move for rook to go to B7. And at this point, we completed the first 25 moves. Materially, Sebastian is ahead by 1 pawn, but he's also ahead in a slightly better position by 0.8. What does his advantage mean? One thing that chess players need to keep in their mind is what would happen if everything disappeared and only kings and pawns remain, because if the pieces are exchanged, you made up like that. You're going to see that white has an enormous advantage with the outside pass pawn on a3. Currently, it's blocked by the queen and the rooks, but if white could exchange them, the pawn on a3 could be decisive. And even if the knight and the bishop remained, look at the black bishop on g7 blocked by the pawn on e4. And if the bishop would change diagonal, then the knight by the pawn on e5, I'm sorry. And if the bishop would change diagonal to liberate itself, the knight would grab the pawn on e5. So clearly, in addition to the extra pawn, white has better prospects, especially if queens and rooks are exchanged. But let's see what will actually happen. Queen goes to d5 for white. Mistakes as a computer and says that this permits the opponent to move a bishop to a more active position. And would rather have the rook go to d2. Queen to a4 for Theodora. Yes, the computer would rather have the bishop go to h6 with a check. It's a miss. Rook to d2 for Sebastian. Pawn to c4, a great move for Theodora. This is the only move that works. This protects the under-defended opponents under attack. Meaning the pawn on e5, I believe, because it was attacked twice by queen and knight, if it's only once by the black bishop on g5. But now, look what's happening. If the knight from f3 takes the pawn on e5, then the rook on b5 will take the white queen on d5. The queen needs to leave and not be on the 5th rank anymore. What will Sebastian do? Queen goes to d8 with a check. Of course, it's great because, or at least it looks great, because Theodora has only one legal move, believe it or not. Now she's forced to place her bishop from g7 to f8. And if Sebastian can place another rook on the 8th rank, or the knight can go somewhere to threaten the bishop, it can easily lead to a mate. That's why this move was very tempting, but computer thinks it's a miss. This misses an opportunity to tactically win a pawn. Computer would rather have the queen go to c6, threatens the pawn on c4, and the computer believes that now, until now, the two players would go back and forth with advantages of less than 1.0, but now Theodora has a huge advantage of 3.5. But will she be able to keep it? To begin with, now she doesn't have a choice. Bishop goes to f8, the only move. It's so nice when you're forced, you only have one move, so you don't have to think about it. Sebastian places the rook on c2, the best possible move. The strongest option is the computer. Rook and rook goes to b7 for Theodora. Good moves is the computer, not the best possible. Would rather have the rook go to a8 and threaten the white queen. But now the pawn on b2 is attacked twice by the two rooks, defended also twice by the rook on c2 and the king on c1. But this pawn could easily be in danger soon if white is not careful. For example, if the pawn goes to c3, the pawn is in danger, and if the rook takes the c3, then the black rook can take on b2. Queen goes to e8 for white. Inaccuracy, the computer would rather have it to c8 to threaten the pawn on c4. And now Theodora's advantage becomes even greater, 4.2. Rook to b8 for Theodora, the best move, threatens the white queen, and we completed the first 30 moves, and by now Theodora starts having an enormous advantage. 4.2 is quite a significant advantage. Still, it is not so decisive since there are queens on the board. Every side has one queen, two rooks, and one light piece, and still white, Sebastian, has a material advantage of one pawn. So in spite of what the computer says, the game has not yet been decided. We'll continue now. Queen to c6 for Sebastian, excellent moves as a computer. And bishop takes to a3, brilliant move, says the computer. So Theodora gets back the pawn she was behind, but she's willing to sacrifice her bishop. That is why it's called a brilliant. And before we continue, let's start thinking, why did Theodora play it? What would happen if she lost her bishop? Then queen could go to a3 with a check, and the white king is under a lot of pressure. If it goes to d1 or d2, then the rook can go to d8 and check. You might even have, but it doesn't work so well. If the rook from d5 goes to b1 to check the white king, the king will go to d2, but then the rook from b1 cannot take on g1, or at least it has nothing to gain, because then the knight on f3 will take back. Let's see what is this, how will this going to continue. But Sebastian was too suspicious. In the previous video, we said you don't look a gift horse in the mouth. But this is a gift bishop, and Sebastian didn't like it, rejected the gift. So what was happening, and instead placed his king to d1. Good moves as a computer, that's fine is a comment, but the computer would rather have white not take the bishop, but take the pawn on c4, because it's advancing too much. And Theodora will check with her rook from d8, the best move. This wins material, says a comment, and let's see how will white reply to the check. How many legal moves? King can go back to c1, can put the rook on d2 or the knight. Of course, the queen will not go to d7, d6, or d5. You don't want to lose your queen. And the king can go to e1 or e2. Let's see how will Sebastian reply. Knight goes to d2, the best move according to the computer. Bishop to b4. For Theodora, this means that her bishop is not for grabs any longer. It was there for, let's see how many moves it was. For a couple of moves, but Sebastian didn't like it. Now it's too late to gain it. And we have the knight on d2 that is pinned, is attacked twice by the bishop before the rook on d8, and is protected twice, rook on c2, king on d1. So for now, black is not winning material out of that, but might soon win. The pressure becomes quite large. King to c1 for white. And the computer says this permits your opponent to eventually win a material and even shows mate in 14 moves for black. You see the M14. It means that on a perfect game, Theodora can checkmate in 14 moves. Let's see what is happening here. And let's see if Theodora will continue the best possible way. The computer would rather have the pawn go to b3, but still, even if this happened, you see that Theodora has an advantage of 5.6 that is enormous. I will continue now with the next move of Theodora. Bishop takes to d2. Computer doesn't think it's the best possible move, would rather have the rook go to d2, but a check is a forcing move and you always prefer it if you cannot see all the moves ahead. So instead of having mate, now she has still an enormous advantage of 7.5. At this point, Sebastian resigned and Theodora made another upset, once again beat an opponent that was about 400 points rated higher than her, and this time in fact with black pieces. And let's see the follow-up suggested by the computer. And the best possible game, you see that Theodora would end up having queen and rook versus rook for Sebastian, and also have 5 versus 2 pawns, and from here clearly anybody, I would say even someone at my rating or below, could easily win the game. Congratulations to Theodora for such a great game, and also good game for Sebastian. That's played quite well. But let's see what does the computer have to say about the two players. How did they do in this game? We're going to the other screen. And here we are. Accuracy 75.2 for Sebastian and 87.5 for Theodora. Ratings, Theodora played quite well. Not the 2600 of the previous game, but even the 2400 that she played is fantastic. It's a great rating. Sebastian played for 1850, meaning each of them almost played at the rating of the opponents, but no reason to criticize Sebastian. It can happen in games sometimes. One poor move or one inaccuracy or one mistake can change quite a lot. And even the 1850 is much higher than my own rating and the ratings of the vast majority of chess players. So no reason to criticize Sebastian for this performance. And let's see the various categories now. In the exclamation mark points, Theodora has 4 versus 2 of Sebastian, which means that Theodora had one brilliant move when her bishop went to a3 and offered itself for sacrifice. 2 great moves for each of the players. Best move 9 for Theodora, 8 for Sebastian. 1 excellent for each of them. Best moves 9 for Theodora, 8 for Sebastian. Which means if you include the 9 book moves that you'll see later, Theodora had 20 out of her 34 moves being the best possible, more than half of them. I'm sorry, I miscounted. 22 out of 34. Almost 2/3 of the moves for Theodora were the best moves, and let me count once again. 1 plus 2, 3 plus 9, 12 plus 9, 21 out of 34 were best moves for Theodora, 21 out of 34. Yes, more than half, a little bit less than 2/3. And for Sebastian, 2 plus 8, 10, and 9, 19. A little bit more than half were the best moves. So you see these two players played very well. We said best 9 for Theodora, 8 for Sebastian. Excellent. 1 each. Good moves. 4 for Theodora, 2 for Sebastian. 9 book moves each of them. And in the negative categories, inaccuracies, 4 for Sebastian, 3 for Theodora. Mistakes, 5 for Sebastian, 3 for Theodora. And misses, 3 for Sebastian and 1 for Theodora, and no blunders. And this concludes the coverage of this game. Congratulations to Theodora for her upset, not just a win, but an upset, for great performance. We'll continue with more of my Facebook friends that have suggested games they would like me to highlight. I would like to thank all of the viewers, especially the subscribers, Theodora being one of them. If you have not yet subscribed, all you need to do is click the subscribe button. Thanks to the likes and to the positive comments I've had. As I mentioned before, we'll continue with more games suggested by my Facebook friends. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for watching. This is Harry Lausanesiris and my YouTube channel grecochess. Goodbye.